The racial hatred of the Ku Klux Klan and its supporters provided the catalyst for many African Americans to express their feelings through the arts. The Harlem Renaissance was a cultural explosion. It coincided with the massive northern migration of African Americans looking for new industrial jobs. In 1925, writer Alan Locke coined the ideological term, the New Negro Movement. His belief was that racial advancement through aesthetic exploits would eventually lead to political and economic action. It was during this time that a former busboy turned poet, Langston Hughes, penned his first volume of verse entitled The Weary Blues. His self-realizations captured the feelings and moods of many African Americans. In Negro Speaks of Rivers, Hughes writes,
I've known rivers. I've known rivers ancient as the world and older than the flow of human blood in human veins. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. I've bathed in the Euphrates when dawns were young. I built my hut near the Congo, and it lulled me to sleep. I looked upon the Nile and raised the pyramids above it. I heard the singing of the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans, and I've seen its muddy bosom turn all golden in the sunset. I've known rivers, ancient dusky rivers. My soul has grown deep like the rivers.
Gene Toomer, Claude McKay, Zora Neale Hurston, and County Cullen were other writers who helped define the Harlem Renaissance with their beautiful words. Visual arts were represented by Lois Mailou Jones, William H. Johnson, and Palmer Hayden, whose works reflected struggle and pride. On stage, actor and activist Paul Robeson captivated audiences in the title role of William Shakespeare's Othello. Starlet Josephine Baker sang and danced into the hearts of America in Shuffle Along, one of the first plays written, produced, and directed by African Americans. The most popular aspect of the Harlem Renaissance was the emergence of jazz music. Another epithet for the 1920s is the Jazz Age. Never has a style of music so effortlessly captured the mood and feelings of a decade than jazz. For its critics, it represented a musical manifestation of society's downfall. For its fans, jazz represented the infinite possibilities of new social freedoms.
Jazz came pretty much from New Orleans. It may be a cliche, but like a lot of cliches, it happens to be true. A combination of ragtime, blues, brass band music, perhaps classical music, and it all kind of, you know, New Orleans is kind of a melting pot with various, a lot of French influence there that you don't find elsewhere in the country, and may have had a lot to do with it, and Caribbean music as well.
The music migrated north to Chicago and Harlem, boasting acts like Joe King Oliver, Bessie Smith, Sidney Bechet, and Jelly Roll Morton. The most popular jazz musician of the 1920s was a young cornet player out of the Louisiana Bayou named Louis Armstrong. Nicknamed Satchmo from his insistence on being called Reverend Satchelmouth, Armstrong began his career as the apprentice to fellow cornetist King Oliver. In 1925, Armstrong switched to the trumpet and started his own band, Hot Five, which produced race records, albums targeted and sold to black audiences. Here he recorded his first vocals and innovated his patented scat singing. Legend has it that Armstrong started improvising scat after he dropped his sheet music midway through a song. Satchmo became a huge crossover success in the jazz age, appealing to all races around the world. Mainstream white America was introduced to jazz by a Caucasian quintet called the Original Dixieland Jazz Band, whose Livery Stable Blues sold over 1 million copies. In 1924, show tune composer George Gershwin performed the jazz concerto Rhapsody in Blue with a 23-piece jazz band. Crowds went wild for Gershwin's music. One musician exclaimed, "Men and women were fighting to get in the door, pulling and mauling each other as they sometimes do at a baseball game, or a prize fight, or in a subway." Jazz music was the perfect soundtrack for a new generation of carefree young women coming of age in the 1920s. In her poem, The Flapper, writer Dorothy Parker proclaimed,
"The playful flapper here we see, the fairest of the fair. She's not what Grandma used to be, you might say, au contraire."
This modern woman of the 20s was very different from the Gibson girl of her mother's generation. With the many new freedoms, including the right to vote, women became less passive. Flappers, named after the sound their unbuckled galoshes made, partook in many of society's taboos. They smoked, drank, wore makeup, and spoke openly about sex.
There was the reaction against the flapper, women wearing short skirts and smoking and wearing lipstick and makeup and being real flippant. Of course, some of the real high ones, if you see some of the pictures, you see some women running around wearing suits and ties and smoking cigars.
Flappers' androgynous style insulted traditions of femininity. They wore their hair short or bobbed and often had flattened chests. Skirts were worn above the knee, leaving little to the imagination. Flapper culture was another in a long line of examples of society's break from tradition. Nothing captured this cycle more than a seemingly simple court case in Tennessee.